So my name's Ben Vickers. I'm based in London. I work in the arts, technology. My background is a mix of policy, curation, writing, theory, exploring, and online virtual worlds. I guess I read the white paper for Bitcoin pretty early on. I was like following the discussions. And then I kind of felt like it was a super libertarian technology, and I would align more with, I don't know if this is on camera, but certainly it's not.
It is. It's all on.
Well, I might not say exactly where my alignment falls, but I felt that like I couldn't necessarily get involved in Bitcoin, but I was like super interested in the potential of Bitcoin as a disruptive technology to existing institutions. And so I started hosting like conversations. Like in 2011, I did a series of meetups, but it was not for the tech community. It was more for like kind of the radical left of London and academics and artists and just like a weird mix of people to come together and just like talk about in a very non-technical way. That's how I got involved. That was 2000. I mean, I think I started hosting those sorts of things around 2010, 11.
Okay, wow, that was early.
Yeah. I didn't invest in Bitcoin. I did invest in Ethereum. I mean, when Ethereum came around, or when I was like watching these like YouTube videos of like Vitalik talking about, I could see like based on what I'd read of kind of Nick Szabo's stuff on smart contracts, that this was much more interesting, that we weren't just talking about like a totally decentralized currency that replaces like central banks, but we were talking about something that could result in different forms of organizing. And over the last couple of years, like I've gone through this process with various groups that I'm involved in of trying to like form corporations, cooperatives. I come from both a tech background and an artistic background. And I'm interested in that sort of history in the arts of organizing in different ways, whether it's like situationists, the Bauhaus, all of these different movements that have like had different forms of organizing. Okay, so when I saw them like a Vitalik and reading online, and like the early Ethereum website went up and it was talking about this idea of what at the time was called decentralized autonomous corporations, which quickly changed to decentralized autonomous organizations, and now I think is democratic autonomous organizations, while staying entirely the same thing. I was very interested in the potential of that form of organizing for a lot of different things that I'm involved in. I have a particular interest in monastic codes, particularly the Benedictine rule as a sort of precursor to open source software development. So the way in which the Benedictine rule is composed of 73 rules about how you organize buildings and people living together, which is actually a very complicated thing to do. And that's a big part of my work on a project called our monastery. And so I'm interested about, as we move more and more towards kind of rules, and not just rules, but rules written in software that automate processes between individuals and people and basically everything, whether it's like your fridge or your phone or any number of these kinds of platforms or interactions. As rules become a more essential part, I think that we need to kind of revisit what rules mean. So the word rule at the time of Benedict meant orientation line. So there's a kind of flexibility in that. And so looking at something like DAOs and having a good understanding of kind of technological development, that decentralized autonomous organizations are going to become a major part of organizing on planet Earth, it seems sensible to go back into history and look at the formation of how rules come about and how groups can operate together. So I'm kind of interested in the potential for kind of sovereign orders emerging in the same way as monastic orders operated in, say, the 10th to 15th century. I think this is a big thing that's missed in the context of Silicon Valley most of the kind of way in which we're talking about startup culture and the sorts of formations of groups we're seeing emerge, that the best examples of previous adherence to rules beyond the state, because most of this comes from with a sort of anti-statist agenda, is to look to religion and to understand programming as a form of scripture. And I think part of what's kind of maybe scary to some degree when we look at things like decentralized autonomous organizations, the idea of autonomy merged with artificial intelligence lends itself very comfortably to thinking about, you know, maybe a benevolent God, maybe not a benevolent God, but a external entity that makes decisions about how you or I interact with each other and the things that we do on a daily basis. And this is something that I think in my own work in association with monasticism and thinking about how you would translate existing rule sets into a decentralized autonomous organization, we very quickly realized that it's quite difficult to not build authoritarian structures. And so this is a major question in the sort of research and the stuff that I'm exploring, and trying to find people that are prepared right now to restructure, say, their daily routine, the way that we make decisions together, whether you introduce, you know, almost like cooperative taxation amongst a select group of people that want to achieve a certain goal, whether you can begin to get people to agree with this kind of idea and go along with it, rather than just like speculating or suggesting that this is the way in which we might live in the future, but to actually test out the software now is a kind of major interest, and something I think that's extremely urgent, because what's not happening, whilst Ethereum for the most part is coming from this kind of decentralized agenda, very quickly it's been adopted by states, regulatory bodies, and they're building very, very large platforms that will essentially build platforms that never forget within institutions that never forgive. And for us not to be well versed in this technology on a much more kind of personable, cooperative level, and to be, I guess, almost like the experts in that field before those systems are implemented, is a whole kind of different trouble that really kind of, there needs to be a fork in that path around about now. Some friends of mine did a survey of the entire blockchain space about 12 months ago and concluded that I think it was something like 98% of everything available was vaporware, and just, you know, it's kind of a website and an idea, and you know, the criteria for that was like, is there a community, is there a GitHub repository, like, is anybody discussing this beyond like a fancy website? And you know, 12 months ago that was not the case. What's amazing in the last like 4 or 5 months is you've had all these platforms come online, things like Colony, Backfeed, Aragon, like most of these have kind of alpha products that you can be running now. And so already you can put your like articles of association for your company, your annual general meetings into Aragon, you can run your whole workflow on Colony, you can distribute your own token within your organization. And so already there are these platforms that allow you to migrate basically everything that you're already doing to the blockchain space. And I think that it's quite important that a real plurality of different kinds of organizations, people coming from different backgrounds, begin to do that now in order to find the sort of fault lines in those things. The other thing I would say is that one of the problems I've identified is all of this stuff is trying to go with almost like a caricature of what that industry previously looked like. So all of the blockchain platforms that you currently see in existence that are talking about music don't actually come from music scenes. They don't actually know that most of the kind of underground music scenes and even the mainstream music scenes have shifted their business model in the way in which they think about distribution, where they allocate value, the way they organize different groups, the role of like concerts, like DIY, all of these different like cultural spaces have had to respond to the effect of things like Napster and Spotify, etc. But a lot of the blockchain stuff that you're seeing develop is developing on the basis that Spotify is the kind of de facto economic model by which these industries are organizing, and that's not true. And so there is a real need for people from, whether it be like fringe subcultures or kind of just alternative scenes, to enter this space and begin to shape the technology in the image of the way in which that's working, or to launch their own platforms, because actually you'll get a much more coherent, up to the minute representation of the way that people are actually doing things. And I think that's critical. So an end to caricatures. You know, my job is like CTO at the Serpentine Galleries, right? So it's not the most common role in terms of being involved in the blockchain space. And I see a lot of people thinking about, from a kind of outside perspective, of how to operate within the art world, whether that be creating kind of speculative markets for auction prices, whether it's creating new kinds of gallery or its certification systems. And all of that knowledge, whilst technically very sophisticated and intelligent, if the art world were a rational marketplace, which it is completely not, it's like the most exceptional archaic economy on the planet. The nuances of that world, if the technologies that people are proposing in it were to be implemented, it would break the art world. Like, and not to say that that won't happen, but it's also like you need to spend a lot more time in the space just observing before you design the perfect solution. I mean, in the same way as like in permaculture, the rule of permaculture is you spend a year looking at the landscape, understanding it, understanding the rhythms and flows of these sorts of things, and then you decide what you're going to do in that landscape. There's almost too many things to say, right? A lot of my work over the last 18 months, so I've run a couple of like small conferences and workshops and things of this nature for people that are specifically involved in the cultural sector, because there aren't many people who are aware of the impact that blockchain is going to make on the development of all kinds of fields. So whilst my interest is a kind of renaissance in the way in which artists, designers, architects, cultural practitioners of all kinds come together to organize. So I'm thinking like guild-like structures that used to exist, what artists do in terms of collectives, schools like the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College. Like, there is a long, long history of different ways in which artists or cultural producers have organized each other and organized cultural production. So the essential thing that I'm most interested in is the possibility of lowering the cost of organizing and the ability for people to constitute new organizations that allow them to do things that have otherwise been held on to by the commercial gallery system or the art market or auction houses, or to some degree the museums, although I think the museums take a much slower kind of back seat in all of that. I'm very interested in that moment in which one group of artists, being particularly innovative, find a good model, and literally all artists emerging from art school start copying and pasting that model, and suddenly all of the organizing structures that the kind of hierarchical art world has relied on in order to maintain power and to describe the structure of history, because essentially museums control time in the way in which they organize culture from different civilizations. That decoupling moment is the thing that I'm most excited about. In that it's a totally irrational market. Yeah, I mean, I think the ICO thing is like somewhere in the same terrain as like the sale of a Basquiat painting for 113 million at Sotheby's. Like, those things are kind of in the same space in that they represent a sort of exceptional economy. I think that often in the blockchain space, it is underrepresentative how bizarre this moment is. So I often, when I'm describing Ethereum, I don't necessarily go into the detail of how a blockchain functions, but I talk about it in terms of its ability to self-replicate. So the fact that they were able to put forward a proposal, ask people to give money on a basic exchange rate that then led to the distribution of those funds that then enabled a system that anyone else could replicate that same idea, is really incredibly fascinating. I don't think that that should be undermined necessarily in its innovative nature based on the insanity of the last 2 months in respect to ICOs. I think that as an idea is extremely powerful. In terms of the value that people are assigning to ICOs, it's like it's turned the whole Silicon Valley thing on its head, and I think that ultimately it's actually quite destructive to the productivity of the space, because the old model in Silicon Valley for venture capital used to be, you have a smart idea, you get a group of people together, you convince other people it's a smart idea, you get the investment, but you can only use that investment to fund the production of your idea, and then you work really hard for a year, 2 years, you completely burn out, and either your idea crashes into the ground or you have an amazing exit, and like you then maybe like a couple of years out you IPO, and then hopefully your shares are fully vested, and then like you get to cash out, and then you can finally like kind of bask in the glory of all the work you've done over the last 5 years. Like ICOs are the reverse of that. It's like you have a vaguely good idea, and then you put it on the internet and everybody gives you money for this speculative idea that you might come to fruition in the future, and you've ended up with all the money you could ever imagine. And now the reason I think that this is destructive to the space is not because I necessarily think they're scams or anything like this, but if you, the big difference, one of the major drivers to realizing those ideas is because you're poor and you might want to make money from your idea. But if you get given all the money at the beginning, everybody gets totally drunk and hysterical on being like extremely affluent, and they have to do this like also this like weird reality integration of looking at their bank balance and it says like 120 million, and that kind of reality distortion and that safe buffer really disrupts your ability to produce things of value. And so I mean that's kind of my totalizing view on ICOs. In terms of how it relates to the art world, I don't know whether there's like a direct relation apart from the exceptional economy part that I spoke about before, but I do think that there's an interesting opportunity in relation to artwork in that at the moment the ownership model for art is almost entirely like an elite class of individuals owning the cultural objects, or states providing the money necessary, or individuals providing the money necessary in order for museums to have those works in their collections. And the whole ICO model opens up not just an interesting space for kind of crowdsourced investment and sale of artworks, but it also opens up a space in which you could have like micro ownership of works and a fully distributed model for the ownership of culture. I think this is an interesting avenue that hasn't in any way been explored yet.